Welcome back, everyone. We are now in Chapter 6 in Fundamentals of Inorganic Glasses, which is on the general topic of composition property relationships in glasses. As glass scientists and engineers, one of our main goals is to try to understand how the chemistry of a glass influences its structure and how that influences the resulting properties. We want to do this both for a fundamental scientific understanding of glass, as well as the ability to apply that understanding toward the design of new glass compositions. So the next several lectures are dealing with different properties of glass, and this particular lecture, number 14 on Chapter 6, is meant to be an introduction of some general principles that we follow when dealing with composition property relationships in glass. So let's jump into it. This first slide, which I've titled Decoding the Glass Genome, kind of gets to the crux of what we're trying to do with the design of new glasses. One of the things that you noted from the lectures so far is that just about any liquid chemistry could be quenched into the glassy state, provided that it is cooled fast enough to avoid crystallization. And what this means is that almost the entire periodic table is at our disposal in terms of things that we could potentially put into a glass. Now, of course, many of these elements could be radioactive or toxic in other ways or too expensive. Noble gases wouldn't go so well into glasses. But most of the other elements are things that we could consider putting into glass. And because of the non-crystalline structure of glass, this means that we don't have to obey the same rules of crystal stoichiometry, which means that we can continuously adjust the composition of glass to get the properties that we want to obtain. And what this means is that since we have nearly all of the periodic table available and we can adjust the composition continuously, that there are, in principle, an infinite number of possible glasses that could be made. We can fine-tune to get the exact chemistry that we want to obtain the combination of properties that we want. And so this idea is that we go from the design of our particular chemistry by mixing the various elements from the periodic table to designing our glass structure. And then that glass structure leads to the properties that we observe, such as shown here. This is the Vickers hardness of a glass as a function of sodium content. Now, when it comes to glass structure property relationships, some of the things that we want to do are to develop new quantitatively accurate predictive capabilities with physics-based models, enhanced with machine learning models wherever appropriate. And although a lot of work has been done to develop some of these modeling capabilities, there are still many opportunities for new model development for new types of glass chemistries and to predict new types of properties. Now, in my previous career, I worked in the glass industry for many years, and a large part of my job was to develop new glass compositions for commercialization. And what I found is that it's never just one property that you need to pay attention to, but it's always a combination of different properties. And there is a set of properties that we care about from a product-facing point of view or from a customer-facing point of view. For example, if we consider a cover glass for a cell phone, this could include properties related to its ion exchange performance for chemical strengthening, the resulting damage resistance, how quickly the stresses relax during the ion exchange process, what is the chemical durability, does it have a low enough density, an appropriate coefficient of thermal expansion, hardness, Young's modulus, and so on. These are all properties that we care about as users of the glass. And so that's why these are called product-facing attributes. At the same time, there's a whole list of properties that the customer really doesn't know about or doesn't care about for use of the product, but we very much care about in terms of enabling the large-scale manufacturing of glasses. Because any glass that we make, it's not enough to just make a small sample in the lab. We need to be able to produce it at large scale, which means it needs to be able to melt at large scale. It needs to have low enough cost, high enough quality. We need to be able to form it into the shapes that we want. And this involves properties such as liquidus temperature and the viscosity curve of the glass. What are the temperatures at which the glass is melted and formed? Is the glass compatible with refractory materials that are used in melting and forming? For electrical melting, it depends on the electrical resistivity of the melt. And can we minimize defects in the glass melting? And also, can we construct a combination of batch materials to achieve low enough cost, high enough purity, and be able to source those materials in large enough quantities? And the thing is, every time you change the composition of a glass, it's not just one of these properties that changes on its own, but all of these properties change simultaneously. So all of the product-facing properties, all of the manufacturing-facing properties, they all change when you change the composition of the glass. And in order to design a successful glass product, we need to strike this appropriate balance between achieving all of our product-related attributes and our manufacturing-related attributes. So we need to find that composition that can achieve all of these properties that we care about from a customer use perspective and from a manufacturing perspective. Now, what this means is that it is really helpful to have quantitatively predictive models for each of these properties that we care about. And when we think about modeling of materials in general or modeling glasses specifically, there is a whole range of different types of models that are available to us. And it's often not just a single type of model that is useful, but some combination of different models that we want to use to apply these to all these different types of properties that we care about. Now, on this graph, what I've done is plotted a bunch of different modeling techniques from purely empirical models on the left that don't know anything about the underlying physics of the glass to models that incorporate very detailed fundamental physics on the right. So on the rightmost side of this graph here, we've got quantum mechanical models. There's a range of quantum mechanical approaches that can be used to model the detailed atomic and electronic structure of glasses. In principle, we could solve the entire glass design problem using quantum mechanics. The problem is that the computational requirements for computational quantum mechanics are so great that it's not really practical to try to solve every problem with quantum mechanics. That being said, there are certain properties related to, say, optical properties or electronic properties, where quantum mechanics can give you some key insights that you would not gain from other types of modeling approaches. So quantum mechanical models like Hartree-Fock theory, molar-Poisson perturbation theory, density functional theory, these can be useful as a part of a greater, more broader modeling approach that also incorporates other types of models that are more computationally efficient. If we move a bit to the left here, backing off from the electronic level modeling that quantum mechanics offers to more atomic scale modeling, these are commonly used simulation techniques like molecular dynamics or Monte Carlo techniques, where these take a classical approach. So instead of trying to solve Schrodinger's equation at the quantum mechanical level and getting the full electronic structure of the materials, atomistic scale modeling uses classical physics, considering the atom as the fundamental unit. Molecular dynamics and Monte Carlo simulations consider how atoms interact with each other in a classical sense, and they are thus able to access much larger systems compared to quantum mechanics, get to longer length scales and longer time scales as well. And they can offer a more statistically significant description of glass structure and access some properties that are very difficult to access from quantum mechanics, like mechanical properties, for example, some thermal properties as well. That being said, atomic scale models like molecular dynamics require accurate interatomic potentials to be developed for a particular chemistry, and they're still quite limited in terms of the size of the system and the length scale of the system that they can access. So if we move more to the left, there are other types of models that can be mesoscale models or models that build on continuum approaches like finite element analysis. These can get things like the overall stress state in a glass material as it's used in, say, an entire glass product. For example, if you put a thin sheet of glass in a cell phone and expose the cell phone to a drop event, what are the stresses that are evolved as a result of that drop event? Finite element analysis is able to do that because it treats the glass as a continuum. It doesn't know anything about the atomic scale structure. What it does know is some of the macroscopic properties of the glass, things like its Young's modulus, and then how that translates into stresses and stress distributions within the material. There are also analytical models that have been derived to describe things like the diffusion of ions into glasses, the viscosity as a function of temperature, the crystallization behavior. And we already covered some of the crystallization models previously. We're going to cover diffusion models and viscosity models later in this course. But oftentimes these analytical models can provide a lot of key insights using a few physically meaningful parameters. On the other hand, if we go uh, entirely on the left-hand side of this diagram, we can also model glass properties using purely empirical models. These are also known as data-driven models, and these are models that don't know anything about the underlying atomic structure of glass or about any of the physical principles that govern glass composition, structure, property relationships. These data-driven models basically just take in a large set of data, so either experimentally measured data or data from, say, simulations, and then they try to construct a set of mathematical equations that would map the inputs to a set of outputs, where the inputs are, say, the chemistry of the glass, and then they would use these empirical mathematical models to map that glass chemistry to the properties that we care about. So data-driven models come in a number of different forms. We're going to have an introduction to them a bit later in this lecture that includes very simple types of linear regression models, all the way through very complicated types of, say, machine learning models. Now, many of these approaches are general approaches that can be applied to any types of materials. These data-driven models, finite element models, MD, DFT models, these are all commonly used across not just glasses, but many other types of materials. There are also, because of the unique properties of glass, the non-crystalline structure of glass, the non-equilibrium thermodynamics of glass, there are some unique modeling approaches that have been designed specifically for glassy systems or liquid systems. That includes topological constraint theory. We had an introduction to that in chapter 3. This was built to try to connect the glass structure to its network of constraints and then connect that rigidity of the glass network back to properties. There's also an approach called energy landscapes, which we'll touch on toward the end of the class. And that is an approach for trying to capture all the detailed kinetics and thermodynamics of the system based on mapping out all the possible configurations of the glass. There's also statistical mechanical modeling. And this is an extremely powerful approach for glassy systems because we don't know the exact positions of the atoms in glasses. We only know them with a particular probability. And so statistical mechanics is able to take those probabilities and then map them to properties as well as the distribution of properties. So it's really important when trying to both understand the composition property relationships in glass and use that understanding to design glasses, to have a set of modeling tools where we can pick and choose which combination of these models are going to be most appropriate for different properties. Certain types of modeling are going to be better for certain types of properties. And since we care about a wide range of properties, that means that we almost always want to have a combination of different modeling approaches where we can combine them together to get the more comprehensive picture of the glass. And of course, this needs to be done working closely with experimental data as well. And the idea is that if we have accurate models to predict each of the properties that we care about, then the process of designing a new glass or optimizing a new glass becomes a mathematical optimization exercise. For example, this is one of the glasses that I had developed in my previous career working in industry. This is one of the Corning Gorilla glasses, where if we were to put this under an old type of scratching event, under a diamond Vickers indenter and just scratch it across there, the old glass would have really bad cracking. This is a lateral cracking, which compromises the performance of the glass. And under an even higher load here, going from 0.5 newtons to 0.75 newtons, the new glass is able to suppress all of that lateral cracking and just have this microductal groove that gets imprinted into the glass. And this was developed as a result of this constrained mathematical optimization exercise where what we want to do is define one of the properties that we care about the most, in this case, the compressive stress of the glass to try to maximize damage resistance. And this is like the most important property from a customer point of view. It's a property that you want to either maximize or minimize. In this case, we wanted to maximize the compressive stress of the glass by adjusting the composition of the glass. So this is by adjusting the mole percent of alumina, boron oxide, sodium, magnesium, and so on. You'll note that the most predominant glass former here is silica. Silica is missing because that is just given by 100% minus the summation of everything else. All of the compositions of the glass have to add up to 100 mole percent. And what that means is that we don't need to specify every one of them independently. We can specify all but one of them. And then the last one is just given by 100% minus the sum of everything else. So in this case, we don't need to specify the composition of silica because it's just 100% minus the summation of everything else. So we want to maximize the compressive stress by adjusting these compositional components, but then it's subject to constraints, and it's subject to constraints on all the other properties that we care about from a customer-facing point of view and from a manufacturing point of view. And so this becomes a constrained mathematical optimization exercise, and if it's done properly, what you get out is the optimized glass composition. And in fact, that's what we have here is the optimized glass composition and subsequent experimentation and industrial scale-up and commercialization. And in fact, proved that this was the optimum glass composition, and this has gone on to sell many billions of pieces of glass that have been used in cell phones around the world. So getting back to some general principles now of glass composition property relationships. So many properties, including viscosity, Young's modulus, hardness, strength, durability, and so on, are related to the connectivity of the glass network. This is something that we started to understand with Zachariason's model as well as Phillips's topological constraint theory. That if you've got more bonds in the glass network, a greater connectivity, that can give properties like a greater stiffness, a greater hardness, a greater strength, a higher viscosity, a greater chemical durability, and so on. And one of the themes that we're going to be coming back to again and again in this course is how the properties of the glass connect back to the connectivity of the network. So to understand the role of different constituents in a glass, we must think in terms of their impact on the connectivity of the glassine network. This is an older figure that I got from Professor Carlo Pantano, who is retired here from Penn State. This shows typical changes in the properties of a soda-lime silicate glass if you were to, say, increase the proportion of any one of these different oxides. So for example, if you were to take soda lime silicate glass and add lead oxide to it or add barium oxide, that's going to increase the brilliance of the glass, the optical brilliance, by increasing the refractive index, increasing the density of the glass. If you were to increase alkali oxides, whether it's lithium oxide, sodium oxide, or potassium oxide, that decreases the conductivity of the glass network because it creates non-bridging oxygens. That means the viscosity goes down, the fluidity goes up, the thermal expansion coefficient goes up, and the mechanical strength goes down. If you were to add boron oxide to soda lime silicate glass, and you're getting closer now to a typical borosilicate glass like Pyrex, this lowers the thermal expansion coefficient of the glass. Increasing silica increases the viscosity while lowering the expansion and improving chemical durability. Increasing the alumina will increase the durability and viscosity. And if you replace alkalis with alkaline earths like magnesium, calcium, or another divalent like zinc oxide, that would increase the viscosity and improve the durability. So this is just kind of a general set of rules of thumb. It's not meant to be taken for every glass composition for every scenario, but these are typical trends that we observe. Now, I mentioned the importance of empirical modeling. Whenever we can use physical models that build known physical relationships into our modeling approaches, of course, we want to build on them. But in many cases, we simply don't have the understanding to be able to construct models based on fundamental physics. And so we need to go to purely empirical models. The simplest of those is what's called a linear regression model. Linear regression models are built on additivity relationships that can be defined for many properties. For example, if we have some property value here, P, we can approximate that as being a summation of all the different components that we have in the system. So if you've got, say, n different oxide constituents of the system, you add up over each of those, adding up over sodium oxide, calcium oxide, silica, and so on. And then we've got a mole fraction of each species, and that's the little a sub I, and then a coefficient of how much that species contributes to that particular property. So for example, if we wanted to have relate, say, the stiffness of the glass to the mole fraction of each of the components, then there would be a different coefficient here that tells us how much each coefficient each component either increases or decreases the stiffness of the glass. If it's a higher number here for the coefficient, that has a higher positive contribution to stiffness. If it's a lower number or a negative number, then it has a more negative contribution to the stiffness. Now, the thing about linear regression models is that these relationships, these linear relationships, are only valid over limited ranges of composition. And that's because there are many nonlinearities that are observed inherent in many properties, as well as inherent in many glass composition families. So it is expected that there can be linear trends in properties over a limited range of compositions, but over broader ranges of compositions, there are nonlinearities. So some properties are highly nonlinear, things like liquidus temperature, viscosity. These properties themselves are inherently nonlinear with changes in composition. So linear regression models tend to perform not as well for those types of properties. And then there are other common sources of nonlinearities, including mixed alkali effect, where if you mix two different types of alkalis together, you will often find nonlinear trends and properties. The boron anomaly, this is something that we saw in chapter 5, where modifiers added to boron can have two different types of impacts on its structure. It can either convert boron from 3 to 4-fold coordination, or it can convert bridging oxygens to non-bridging oxygens. those two behaviors have two opposite impacts on the conductivity of the network. And so they can push properties in two opposite directions, which means that there's a highly nonlinear scaling of glass properties in borate glasses. There's also something called a mixed network effect, where if you mix two different network formers, say mixing silica and boron oxide, that the modifiers can play a different role depending upon which network former they associate with. And what that means is that just changing the molar ratio of the two different network formers to each other can give significant nonlinearities in the scaling of glass properties. So these are all very common ways to observe nonlinearities in glass properties. Now, linear regression models, such as the first part of the equation shown here, can be expanded to include nonlinear terms, such as the second double summation here, where this now includes a mixing term where the mole fractions of two different components are multiplied with each other, AI times AJ, and then there is a cross coefficient here, or a mixing coefficient, QIJ, which tells the strength of the mixing contribution between the ith species and the jth species. So sometimes you can account for these types of nonlinearities by adding nonlinear mixing terms to the regression model, but other times you need to go to more advanced approaches such as machine learning tools. So machine learning is a way of constructing empirical models that can capture kind of more complicated relationships between glass chemistry and properties. And it is especially useful if you have a large set of data with complicated mapping between glass composition and properties. Machine learning is based on having a large enough set of data, and it has to be data that you can trust, because if you pass in bad quality data, you will get bad quality models, and therefore unreliable results. Now, when it comes to leveraging data, the data that we use for building machine learning models can come from a variety of sources. They can come from literature data. So these are data that are in journal articles or books that compile data. They can come from patents. Patents are usually have a wealth of data available. They can come from your own crucible melts that you do, or industrial melts if you're working at a glass company. And all of this data needs to go into some sort of database or data warehouse where it is in a consistent format that can be accessed for data mining, for analytics and reporting of the data, and for constructing and running models. There are a lot of challenges to what I just described. That includes data integrity. So how to make sure that the quality of your data is good, that you've got accurate data in your databases. Reporting of data. When someone measures new data, how do you make sure that it gets into the database and does so in a consistent format? And if you're working at a company, then data security is incredibly important, because you need to make sure that people from outside your company are not able to access your proprietary data. Another challenge is creating and maintaining dynamically updated models. So if we construct models based on this data, how do we make sure that they stay up to date whenever new data is added? Another challenge is process data. So we know that glass properties depend not just on composition, but also on thermal history. They also depend on any post-processing steps like thermal tempering or chemical strengthening. And so how do you incorporate that process data as well? That is another challenge. Also, how can we bridge our physical understanding and any equations that we know from physics into the empirical modeling approaches? So the empirical models are not just kind of building the models blindly, but are taking advantage of known equations. And a final challenge here is leveraging complex data. So like image data, for example, this is especially useful if we want to construct models for glass ceramics, where we're growing crystalline microstructures in our glassy matrix. Getting SEM data to get glass ceramic microstructures is actually extremely important for having these relationships between the glass ceramic microstructure and properties. And that involves analyzing image data, which presents its own challenges. Now, there are a couple of databases out there. There is the SciGlass database, which originated from Oleg Mazurin and his lab in St. Petersburg, Russia. The SciGlass database was developed in Russia and contains about 500,000 different compositions of both oxide and non-oxide glass compositions. It enables searching for glasses that meet certain composition or property requirements, and it has some simple modeling tools for analysis of the data. Another database is the Interclad database. This was developed in Japan and contains structural information and property information on over 300,000 glass compositions that are scoured from literature and from industry. The problem is neither one of these databases has been kept up to date recently, and it is very difficult to get a hold of these databases and actually use them. And so there actually is quite a gap in the glass community now for having a modern database that is kept up to date with latest data. So this is actually a significant problem that needs to be addressed. But assuming that we have the set of data available, let's suppose that we want to use machine learning to construct a more sophisticated data-driven model. Machine learning, what is it? It emerged from pattern recognition and computational learning theory in the field of computer science. And what it does is that it enables computers to construct algorithms or mathematical models using a training data set. This uses algorithms that iteratively kind of optimize themselves. They're kind of self-optimizing based on data. And this allows computers to find hidden correlations between a set of input and output data without being explicitly programmed where to look. There are different types of machine learning models. One type is a classification model. Classification model just kind of puts things into categories. So if it sees an image, is it a dog or is it a cat? Or if it sees a crystalline microstructure, what type of crystal is it? That would be a classification model. A regression model is one that gives you back a numerical result. So it's no longer a category, but it's saying that, say, the density is 2.37 grams per cubic centimeter. Or it's giving you some sort of numerical result that can be continuously adjusted. So that would be a regression result. One of the most popular types of machine learning models is the neural network model. Neural network modeling is meant to kind of mimic the processing of neurons, like in a brain, for example. And what it does is it takes a set of input, it passes the input to a set of hidden layers. These hidden layers are just mathematical functions that are optimized to try to pass data from one layer to the next until it reaches the output where you get the best possible learning of how to map the input to the output. So basically, there's a whole bunch of mathematical functions that are called in these hidden layers in an attempt to map the set of input to the set of output. Another type of machine learning approach is the time series model, where you can use this to kind of predict what future trends would be like based on trends that have occurred in the past and in the recent history. Now, with the machine learning approach, about 80% of the time is spent on collecting data and just managing the data. Like I said earlier, if your data is garbage, then your machine learning models are going to be garbage. So it's really important to have both enough data to do the training and to ensure that that data is high quality. Getting quality data is very difficult because even though the quantity of data is enormous, sifting through it to get high quality data is challenging. So, for example, every 10 minutes now, humanity generates as much data as we did from the dawn of time through 2003. And the vast majority of that data is just garbage. So how do we sort through that to find out the stuff that's actually worthwhile? That is a very challenging task in itself. Once the data are collected, it needs to be divided into a set of training data that is used for training the machine learning models, and then a set of validation data that is used for validating the machine learning models, all the while holding back a set of test data that is used to test the models after they've been optimized. This process, which is called cross-validation, is extremely important because if you just give all your data to the machine learning model, it is just going to reproduce noise in the data. It's what's called memorizing the data or reproducing noise. And when that happens, it will miss the key trends of the data and just start reproducing all the little errors, all the little noise in your data. And it'll end up being an overcomplicated model that is not truly predictive. So what the model optimization process needs to do is to take maybe a third of that data, train the model based on the third of that data, use another third of the data for validation, for testing it within the model optimization process, while holding back another third of the data that is used for testing once the model is finalized. And by testing the model on data that it doesn't see, that's the only way that you can truly tell if it is working. And it might be possible to have not just one model, but a whole series of models. And oftentimes then using an average of different types of models could give you better results by averaging over an ensemble. So this, I hope, gives you a kind of an overview of different types of principles and different types of models that we use to try to predict the relationships between glass chemistry and properties. For our glass great today, I wanted to give you a brief intro to George W. Morey. He lived from 1888 to 1965. He spent his career at the Geophysical Laboratory at the Carnegie Institution of Washington. He made major contributions to glass and ceramic science and technology, including extensive research on phase equilibria in silicate systems. He also invented what was called the Morey bomb, which was a pressure vessel used for high pressure experiments. He published a book called Properties of Glass back in 1938, and this at the time was the most thorough compilation of data and discussion on glass properties in the literature, including additivity relationships using linear regression models. So this was the first kind of database of its kind that was in, of course, print form. Visitors to his home admired his kitchen garden, which displayed the soda lime silicate phase diagram with different colored flower arrangements to identify different phase fields. And in honor of George Morey, one of the most prestigious awards from the American Ceramic Society's Glass and Optical Materials Division is named in his honor. So to summarize this lecture, glass properties are largely governed by the connectivity of the atomic network. Linear regression models can be applied for some properties over limited ranges of compositions. More sophisticated models are required to capture nonlinearities of glass properties. Accurate, comprehensive databases of composition property data are critical for the design of new glass compositions. Next time, we will move on to chapter 7. We're going to get into the density and molar volume of glass. All right, thanks everyone. I will see you next time. Take care.